man tied to 4 horses, his arms stretched until the joints tore open, his legs pulled until the skin split. He did not beg for mercy. He did not cry for help. He laughed. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Some wept, some vomited. Others could not look away. François Ravaillac, the man who murdered the King of France, was being torn apart in the most brutal execution Paris had ever seen. But what made it worse was not the blood. It was not the screams. It was that he believed it was all worth it, and he smiled through it. He was born in Angoulême in 1578, a small provincial town deep in the heart of France. The world outside was chaos. Religious wars had torn the country apart. Protestants and Catholics killed each other in the streets. But inside the Ravaillac home, the war was quieter and far more dangerous. François was the 3rd son. His father was violent and unstable. His mother was devout, obsessed with Catholic rituals and visions. Between beatings and whispered prayers, François learned 2 things before he turned 10. Pain was everywhere, and God was always watching. He rarely spoke. In school, he sat alone, scribbling crosses into the corners of his pages. Other children avoided him. He looked through them, not at them. His teacher said he was slow. His mother said he was chosen. He watched the priests more than the lessons. He followed them home. He stood outside churches in the rain, unmoving, for hours. He talked about angels. He talked about hell. He asked strangers if they believed they would burn forever. As he grew, his silence deepened, but his mind boiled beneath it. He became obsessed with purity. He believed France had been infected by sin, that its rulers had let her rot. He walked from town to town, attending sermons, kneeling until his knees bled. He wanted to become a monk, but every religious order turned him away. They saw what others had missed. He did not want to serve. He wanted to judge. He tried again and again. He begged to be accepted, but his obsession made them nervous. His questions were not about peace or salvation. They were about punishment. He started to speak of visions, voices that came to him at night, blinding flashes of light, orders, commands, a divine whisper that said France was under threat, and that it was up to him to act. He believed God had chosen him, not to preach, not to build, but to kill. He became convinced that King Henry IV was the reason for France's decay. Henry had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism years earlier. To Ravaillac, this was not unity, it was betrayal. The king had allowed Protestants to live. He had granted them rights. To Ravaillac, that meant blasphemy at the highest level. He told no one, but inside his mind, the plan had already begun. The king must die, not for revenge, not for politics, for God. And François Ravaillac, a quiet boy no one had truly noticed, was going to become his instrument. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos, and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. King Henry IV had been born a Protestant. In a country ruled by Catholic tradition, that alone made him a threat. His rise to power was long, bloody, and controversial. To survive the throne, he had converted. He stood before the church and claimed this Catholic faith. The people celebrated. The Pope gave his blessing, but not everyone believed it. To many Catholics, it was a political trick, a mask worn to gain control. The man who once led Protestant armies was now wearing their crown. They did not forgive. They did not forget. Henry tried to unify his fractured kingdom. He passed the Edict of Nantes, giving Protestants freedom to worship. It was a bold move, and it enraged the hardliners. They saw it as surrender. They called it heresy in royal robes. François Ravaillac was one of them. From the moment Henry signed that edict, Ravaillac believed France had fallen. A Catholic king who tolerated Protestant churches was, in his eyes, no king at all. Ravaillac did not care about diplomacy. He did not care about peace. He believed the king had defiled the soul of the nation, and he was not alone. Across France, whispers turned into threats. Religious fanatics plotted in taverns and churches, but most men only spoke. Ravaillac listened to the silence. He prayed, fasted, and stared at walls for hours. He waited for God to speak again. When rumors spread that Henry planned to invade Catholic lands in Italy, something inside Ravaillac snapped. He no longer believed the king was merely mistaken. He believed he was evil. This was not politics anymore. It was holy war, and Ravaillac saw himself not as a murderer, but as a soldier of divine justice. He left Angoulême with nothing but a dagger, a vision, and a growing fire in his chest. He was headed to Paris, to find the king and end him. He arrived in Paris like a shadow. No friends, no family, no plan except the one God had planted in his mind. François Ravaillac believed he was on a mission. Not a crime, not an act of desperation. This was destiny, carved in heaven and set loose on the streets of France. The voices had grown louder. He said angels whispered to him. They showed him visions of the king in flames, of churches collapsing, of France drowning in blood. Every time he blinked, he saw fire. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard God calling him to act. He tried to find someone who would listen. He approached a priest, told him the king planned to attack the Pope. The priest dismissed him, said he was mad. He went to a monastery, asked again to be admitted. They refused. He shouted in the streets about holy corruption. Passers-by avoided him. His words were too wild, his eyes too still. So he turned inward. He followed the king's carriage for days, memorizing its path. He knew the guards, the stops, the faces. The voices did not stop. He begged God to take the burden away. He wandered through Paris, praying until his knees bled. But the answer was always the same. Do it. Not out of hate, not out of anger, out of obedience. He bought a small dagger, kept it tucked beneath his coat, slept with it under his head. He believed he was preparing for a ritual, something sacred, not murder, something holy. On the morning of May 14th, 1610, he woke before dawn. He did not eat. He did not speak. He stood in the street outside the king's path and waited. The voices were calm now. He had made his choice. Today, France would be cleansed, with one blade. The streets of Paris were restless that morning. Rain had fallen overnight. Carriages moved slower. Mud clung to boots and wheels. Ravaillac stood near the Rue de la Ferronnerie, where the king's carriage always passed. He blended into the crowd. His clothes were plain. His face was blank. The dagger lay cold against his chest, hidden beneath his coat. He had followed the king's movements for days, studied his route, counted the guards. This was the perfect spot, a narrow street, nowhere to escape. At around 4 in the afternoon, King Henry IV stepped into his carriage. He was on his way to visit his chief minister. He did not wear armor. He did not carry weapons. The carriage was open. A simple leather canopy stretched above it, but the sides were bare. He had done this 100 times before. There was no reason to fear, but traffic stopped him. A cart blocked the path ahead. The king leaned forward, annoyed. The carriage came to a full halt. Ravaillac stepped forward. No one noticed at first. The guards were distracted. The street was noisy. He reached into his coat, pulled the dagger, and stabbed the king in the chest. The first blow landed near the ribs. The king gasped, turned. The second plunged deeper, straight into the heart. Henry slumped forward. His body remained upright for a moment, like a statue toppling in slow motion. Then he collapsed. The crowd screamed. The guards grabbed Ravaillac. He did not run. He did not fight. He held the dagger tight in his bloody hand and looked up at the sky. Some say he was smiling. Others say he was praying. But one thing was certain. He believed he had done something righteous. The King of France was dead, and Ravaillac stood in the blood-stained street, waiting for what would come next. The carriage did not move. The king's body slumped sideways. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the cushion, then dripping onto the wooden frame. He did not scream. He did not speak. The second stab had torn through the chest and into the heart. Henry IV of France was gone before his men even realized what had happened. The crowd stood frozen. A queen's husband, a nation's king, had just been killed in broad daylight. No battlefield, no duel, just a crowded street and a blade. The guards lunged. Ravaillac was tackled to the ground. The dagger clattered to the stones beside him. Fists rained down. The crowd joined in. A boot struck his ribs. Someone kicked him in the face. His nose broke. Blood spurted. He didn't resist. He didn't cry out. He curled in on himself, cradling his arms, as though he had done what he came to do. Some shouted for his death right there in the street. One man brought a paving stone down on his back, but the guards pulled him out. Not out of pity, not out of mercy. They needed answers, and they needed him alive. The king's body was rushed away. He was laid out in silence at the Louvre, his eyes still open, blood still wet on his lips. The court watched in shock. France had just lost its monarch to a fanatic. Panic spread through the city. Shops closed. Nobles vanished into their estates. Priests called for calm. Soldiers locked down the gates. But nothing could calm what had been unleashed. The king was dead, and his killer had been caught, intact, breathing, and silent. François Ravaillac sat in a dark cell beneath the courthouse, his face bruised, his hands shaking, but his eyes never left the wall. He had done it. He had listened to the voice. Now he was ready for the price. They dragged him through the prison gates before nightfall. François Ravaillac was thrown into a stone cell beneath the conciergerie. The walls dripped with moisture. The air reeked of piss and blood. He sat on the cold floor, hands tied, face swollen from the beating in the street. He did not cry. He did not speak. He was alone. Above him, the court panicked. A king had been murdered in broad daylight. France had no precedent for this. The queen, now regent, demanded answers. Was this part of a larger plot? Had Spain sent him? The Protestants? The Pope? But Ravaillac offered nothing. He told the guards he acted alone. He told the priests he had been chosen. He told the magistrates that God spoke through him. That was not enough. They wanted names. They wanted confessions. So they broke him. Day after day, they brought him into the interrogation chamber. They tied him to the table. They pressed burning sulfur into his flesh. They drove sharpened wedges between his fingers. They poured boiling oil down his arms. Still, he said the same thing. No one else. No master. No letter. Only God. The court could not believe it. A lone man, acting out of religious fervor, had managed to kill the King of France? It seemed impossible. It seemed humiliating. But the truth didn't change. Ravaillac never gave another name, never blamed anyone else. He called it an act of obedience. He never asked for forgiveness, never wept. Even when they pressed red-hot pincers to his chest, he only muttered scripture. Paris buzzed with rumor. They say he was possessed. They say he drank holy blood. They say he was promised sainthood. But none of it mattered now. His fate was already sealed. On the 13th day after the king's murder, the Parliament of Paris issued his sentence. He would be torn limb from limb in front of the entire city. No clean death, no blindfold. He would feel everything. The cell grew darker with each passing day. The torches burned lower. The silence grew heavier. And the pain never left his body. For 13 days, François Ravaillac was questioned, prodded, tortured, and broken apart piece by piece. Not through execution, not yet. Through method, through ritual, through the cold, controlled destruction of a man's body in search of a truth they refused to accept. He was suspended by ropes and dropped suddenly to snap the joints. He was stretched until tendons tore. Hot irons were pressed into the soles of his feet. His fingernails were removed one by one. The guards asked the same questions. Who told you to do it? Were you hired? Was it Spain? Was it the Queen? Was it the Pope? He gave the same answer. No one. He acted alone. He saw it in a vision. He was told by angels. He heard a voice from the heavens. They called in doctors to evaluate his mind. They found no madness. He was calm, reasonable, polite, except when he spoke of the king. Then his eyes changed. He talked about sin, about purification, about the divine order. He believed the king had corrupted France and that he, Ravaillac, had restored balance. He still thought he was right, even as his flesh blistered, even as his ribs cracked, even as he bled from wounds that would have killed any other man. They offered to end the pain, to give him a cleaner death. All he had to do was name someone. He refused. They stopped feeding him regularly. They kept him in isolation. No light, no contact, just the sound of his own breath, ragged and shallow. When the final judgment was read, he didn't flinch. He would be dragged through the streets. His hand, the one that held the dagger, would be burned off with sulfur. His flesh would be torn with red-hot pincers. Then, tied to 4 horses, he would be pulled apart, limb by limb, until nothing remained but blood and screams. He nodded. He had already made peace with death, but no one was ready for what would happen next. The announcement echoed through the streets of Paris like thunder. François Ravaillac was to be executed in the Place de Grève, the city's public square. But this was no ordinary death. This was not a hanging. This was not a beheading. This was destruction. The court had crafted the sentence not to punish, but to terrify, to remind every citizen what happens to those who raise a hand against the crown. His right hand, the one that stabbed the king, would be burned with boiling sulfur. Then, flesh would be torn from his chest, arms, and thighs, using red-hot pincers. Still alive, he would then be tied by the wrists and ankles to 4 strong horses. The executioners would give the signal, and the animals would pull in opposite directions, not with a single clean snap, with rhythm, with force, with pain stretched out into minutes. They wanted him to feel every moment, and they wanted the people to see it. The Queen approved the sentence without hesitation. The court applauded it. The priests blessed it. They called it justice. The date was set. The scaffolding was built. Ropes were tied. Chains prepared. The horses were selected, trained, and fed for strength. And still, Ravaillac showed no fear. In his cell, he prayed. He whispered scripture. He asked for no last meal. He told the guards he did not regret what he had done. He still believed he had done the will of God. He believed his execution would purify France, just as his blade had cleansed the throne. The city waited. Merchants closed their shops. Women brought children. Thousands prepared to witness the spectacle. No one looked away, not because they were brave, but because they needed to see that even a man who killed a king could be broken. And what they saw on the day of his death would never leave their minds. The morning of May 27, 1610, came cold and gray. The sky was heavy, but it did not rain. Paris was silent, not out of peace, but out of fear. Thousands gathered at the Place de Grève. Shops were closed, bells tolled. Every window facing the square was packed. Children sat on shoulders. Women clutched handkerchiefs. Men watched with tight jaws. In the center stood the scaffold. Thick wooden beams. Chains hanging. Iron hooks bolted into place. Beside it, 4 horses pawed at the ground, restless and strong. They had been trained for this moment. Then, Ravaillac appeared, dragged from the conciergerie, bloodied and barely walking. His clothes had been ripped away. His skin was already torn from weeks of torture, but his face remained calm. No tears, no shouting. They tied him to a wooden table first. His right hand was placed in a bowl of boiling sulfur. The skin blistered and peeled. He did not scream. Then came the pincers. Executioners tore into his chest, arms, thighs. red-hot iron, skin burned, flesh ripped out in strips. Blood flowed across the wood. The crowd began to shift. Some sobbed, some cheered, some turned away. Still, Ravaillac did not cry out. They moved him to the center of the square, laid him flat. Ropes were tied to his ankles and wrists. Each rope was looped through a ring fixed to a horse. The executioner raised his hand. The horses pulled. At first nothing. Then a snap. The right arm broke. The left followed. Legs stretched. Skin split. Bones cracked. He began to scream now, but it was not a scream of fear. It was deep, animal, endless. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not wildly, but enough to make the front row of the crowd go still. The bones tore free. Muscles unraveled. His body began to open like fabric pulled at the seams. And through it all, his head remained tilted back, eyes open, mouth moving. Some believed he was praying. Others swore he was laughing until the very end. No one ever forgot that sound. The crowd had come for justice. What they got was something else. François Ravaillac's body was no longer whole. His limbs were stretched to the edge of rupture. His arms had detached at the shoulders. His legs were still tethered to the horses, twitching with every pull. But his chest was still rising and falling. He was still alive. His mouth moved. Some said he muttered prayers. Others said he cursed the crowd. But then came the moment that silenced even the executioner. Ravaillac laughed. It was cracked and broken. A breathless gasp twisted into something unholy. But it was unmistakable. A laugh. The executioners froze. The crowd, pressed shoulder to shoulder, didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They simply stood, gripped by horror. This was not a man begging for mercy. This was not the scream of someone broken. This was the sound of a fanatic who believed he had won. They increased the force. The horses pulled harder. His torso lifted from the blood-drenched boards, then dropped. A sickening snap. The ribs cracked. The last tendons gave way. His body came apart. One arm landed in the mud. A leg dangled from a horse's side. What was left of his chest slumped, empty and torn. Only then did the crowd exhale. He was dead. The executioners were ordered to continue. They took what remained and threw it onto a pyre. His head, blackened and bruised, was tossed into the flames. The ashes were gathered and scattered into the Seine. There would be no grave, no marker, no chance for any part of him to be remembered. His family was banished. His home was destroyed. His name erased from all official records. But the memory remained. People did not forget the man who killed a king. They remembered the blood, the screams, the moment he smiled through the worst death imaginable. And for years afterward, whenever someone in Paris acted strangely, they whispered the same name, Ravaillac. There was nothing left to bury. No coffin, no procession, no priest said a final prayer. What remained of François Ravaillac was ash and smoke, scattered without ceremony into the grey waters of the Seine. Even that was too much for some. His very name had become a poison in Paris. The city wanted to erase him. His house in Angoulême was destroyed. Stone by stone, it was torn down until nothing but dust remained. His family, guilty by blood alone, was stripped of their name and exiled. His parents were forced to flee. His relatives vanished into the countryside. No one was allowed to say his name in public without fear. No child was christened François for years afterward. It had become a name of death. Still, people whispered. They spoke of how he didn't scream when they burned his hand, how he didn't faint when his skin was torn, how he laughed while being ripped apart. He became something more than a man. He became a ghost, a warning. For the church, it was proof of holy justice. They said God had punished him through the hands of France. For others, it was something darker. They said no normal man could have endured what he did. They said something possessed him, that the devil had wrapped itself around his soul and kept him alive just long enough to curse every soul who witnessed his death. The king was buried in royal silence. but the killer lived on in nightmares. Children were told, "Obey, or Ravaillac will come." His name became a threat, a shadow cast across generations. No monument stands in his memory, no plaque marks where he died. His face does not hang in museums, but in the quiet corners of old Paris, stories still pass between lips, of the man who believed he was sent by God, of the man who drove a knife into the heart of a king, and of the scream that ended in a laugh. The execution was supposed to erase him. Instead, it made him unforgettable. François Ravaillac was dead, but the fear he ignited refused to die. France had seen war. France had seen heretics burn, soldiers fall, and kings slain in battle. But this was different. A lone man, guided by nothing but a voice in his head, had walked into the heart of the capital and plunged a knife into the king's chest. It shattered the illusion of control. If Ravaillac could do it, anyone could. In the months after the assassination, the streets of Paris were flooded with informants. The Queen's Council cracked down on dissent. Sermons were monitored. Letters were opened. Anyone who preached too loudly was watched. Anyone who looked too long at a soldier's sword was questioned. Religious tensions surged again. Protestants were blamed by some, defended by others. Catholics argued among themselves. Priests debated whether Ravaillac had been sent by God or tempted by the devil. He had no allies, no co-conspirators, but that made it worse. They feared the next one would be smarter, quieter, deadlier. Paranoia bloomed across the courts. Ministers looked over their shoulders. Nobles hired private guards. Even the Queen Regent, Marie de Medici, rarely left the Louvre without layers of protection. The Parlement of Paris issued new laws. Punishments grew harsher. Executions more public. The message was clear. What happened on May 14th must never happen again. But it lingered. Not in facts or records, but in memory. Ravaillac had changed something. Not through politics. Not through ideology. Through horror. He became the face of what one man could do when blinded by belief. And that terrified them more than any army ever could. His name disappeared from the official books, but the people remembered. Not because they wanted to, because they could not forget. His was a death that echoed, a death meant to silence, but it left behind a scream that Paris could still hear in the quietest hours of the night, and sometimes, in the back of their minds, they swore they could still hear him laughing. Click the next video. It only gets worse from here. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that are darker than fiction.